Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. I have been going through my closet of things that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I found these Sola Wood Flowers. So, the first thing I needed to do was learn how to turn them in the colors that I wanted to actually make a bouquet. If you've never seen these, they're little wooden flowers. They're very lightweight. The Sola wood comes from the tapioca plant, otherwise known as cassava. These little flowers come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I have some lotus ones, and I'm not sure what the other ones were called, but they feel light, and they feel kind of somewhere in between like a sponge, paper, and wood, so I expect them to be very absorbent. So after I dye them, we want to dry them on something. So I've taken this box. Egg cartons actually work better, but I didn't have any. Originally, when I bought these, I only bought them to do fluid paintings over to add some texture, but now I want to use the rest of them to make a bouquet, and Sola does have their own wood dye, and they have all sorts of supplies that you can purchase from them to make your bouquet perfect, but I want to try to do it with what I have on hand in my studio. Other things I was considering were cost, so I didn't want to use any supplies that would end up costing me a lot to dip a lot of these. Things that wouldn't take me a huge amount of time, so I wanted reward to pay off based on time. So if something was way too laborious and didn't result in that much better of a product, I didn't want to have to do that over and over again. Ultimately, I tested two main things, acrylic craft paint and acrylic inks, but I did do different applications of them to see if putting in a little extra work or a little extra prep would have better results. The first method is to, in a bowl, add water so that you'll have enough to kind of submerge most sides of your flower, and then take the color that you've mixed up. I had a few that I had kind of mixed up to test to see what would happen, and you want to add that paint. Now, they sometimes say to put in a whole thing of craft paint, but I figured out that I could actually pre-test a little bit of this by taking off some of the bottom petals so you wouldn't have to waste an entire one before you put it in there. But you want to make sure once you put the paint in that you mix it really, really well into the water so that you don't have any extra bits that are kind of stick to the leaves and they're full paint. Otherwise you get these weird speckles, and there's not a lot of ways to control that. In this bowl, which is about the size of a cereal bowl, I have filled it up about 2/3 of the way with water, and I added the equivalent of about half a bottle of those mini craft paint bottles, and then all we want to do is dip it in, make sure that it fully saturates the interior part, because sometimes when you just push it down, a bubble forms and it doesn't get all the way in, and just make sure it's really saturated. You can pull it out and leave it to dry, and that definitely worked. I could have made it more saturated, but I do like the kind of faint pink that it has made on there. It is really pretty, so I'm going to start with another test. For this test, I'm actually repeating the same steps as the one previous, but I'm going to use kind of a darker color, a blue, to see how that affects being on the wood flower, if the different pigmentation has a slightly different effect, because the pink that I did was fairly complementary to the natural color of the wood flowers, and so I just wanted to repeat this with a different color. You want to make sure you put enough water in so that you don't have the same problem I did where I had to really kind of scoop it onto the back of it, but this absolutely works. It seems to have soaked up more pigment because of the darker pigmentation, and it looks pretty nice. I like the first one better, but I think that's just a personal preference on color. The next test I did was inspired by how some flowers in the very center have a vibrant, different color than the petals do. So I took some of this bright orange color and just tried to apply it right in the center to see if I could make that center part really vibrant without it just being super duper concentrated in that area. So I actually had to get a paintbrush and kind of apply it, and I applied it to the insides of all the petals. And I was hoping that that orange paint would kind of protect a little bit or pre-saturate, and also since it was more saturated and a brighter color, it would allow me to dip, or I tried kind of just squeegeeing it on first to make a two-toned flower and see how that worked. Sorry that my head is so heavily featured in this video. This angle wasn't working super well with the camera, but we got it. And I was able to get a two-tone, see how there are the two different colors there? So that definitely worked, but it was quite a bit more labor intensive. I mean, it wasn't a huge deal, but I'm not sure I would want to have to do that over and over and over again. I repeated this test on another flower by adding in actually two different colors that I painted on, and then I dipped it in the pink, and it resulted in kind of a neat tie-dye effect on the flower. While I really liked this effect, this would be very time intensive to do this for, you know, a bouquet of even 12 flowers. So you'd have to really like it in order to do this. After I had thoroughly tested the different ways to use the craft paint on these flowers, I wanted to test acrylic inks. And you could technically do some of the similar stuff with watercolor, and I did try to paint a little bit on one of them, but watercolors in general seem to be a lot more expensive, and I use them a lot more for their stated purpose, whereas these acrylic inks I do use, but I use them less often, and so it's better to use them than let them sit on the shelf forever. So I tested these. I've got kind of a magenta color and a bright yellow color. Realizing that I was using up quite a few of my flowers in this testing process and I wasn't sure of my color palette yet, I discovered that I could actually peel off some of these bottom leaves, or some of the ones that were a little goofy looking or something, from the bigger flowers in order to do more tests without having to use entire flowers. Make sure to shake any of your inks thoroughly so you don't have any globs in them, and then I just went ahead and with this magenta color tried applying it directly, and whew, it is pigmented. One of the effects that I've really been wanting to kind of try to capture is I love the flowers where the inside of the petals have a different color, maybe a bright pink, and then the actual petals are, the larger portion are yellow, and I wanted to kind of get that effect, so I was hoping that these would spread out on their own, but they really did just sit kind of on the surface, so I had to force it a little bit. Next, I actually pre-wet the entire petal because the previous test, that would have used a lot of ink and it also was almost too pigmented for my taste. So I went ahead and pre-soaked that petal and then tried applying it directly to the wet petal to see if that would change how that worked. And then I kind of applied the same paintbrush treatment as the one before. And it helped the colors blend a lot more, but man, it is still really pigmented. So if that's the look you're going for, that might be the ticket. Another test was to dilute the ink in some water and then dip the petal directly in. And I was surprised at how much that stained it. I mean, it was more of like a stain than it just really sucked it up. I I tried kind of changing the color because that was a little too mustardy yellow for me, and dipping it in halfway. I like the color a little better. I wanted to go for more of a reddish color. And what I was looking for here was kind of a simple way to make a two-toned leaf. I wanted to dip it at an angle, kind of overlap the two different sides so there would be kind of a center triangle for the petal. And what I didn't kind of expect was it seemed to the previous color I had applied, it seemed to repel the new color I was trying to apply. See how there's still that line? Since dipping it in resulted in a harsh line, I thought maybe if I did more of a natural or kind of haphazard approach where I just piped this in more natural ways so that there were kind of some bubbles and round areas, that this might actually help it. And then I let this sit to soak into those areas and did a few other tests. And I did do a bonus test with watercolor that I had kind of sitting and dried, and it did produce a very nice pink color, but again, this might be way more expensive to use that amount of watercolor to get enough to dip a whole flower in, that I'm not sure this would be cost effective enough even if you really liked the color. I went back to the one that I had dyed the inside with the acrylic ink by kind of blotting it on there, and dipped it in the kind of reddish orange color as best I could. The container was definitely too small for this, but I did what I could. And the color I mixed up was not my favorite, but there was a slight difference in the effect. These dry, and like many things, once dried, things change a lot. And one thing I noticed is when I used the acrylic inks, they really browned. That was not the color that they were before, so I cannot recommend using the acrylic inks on these, especially if they're watered down. It ended up looking kind of ugh. But the craft paint worked great, and I'm definitely going to use that when making my bouquet. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear about your experiences if you've used their dye, their proprietary dye, and I hope you have a magically creative day.